question that I want to use to frame to the reflections I want to offer tonight and tomorrow morning and tomorrow night is simply, where do we live? That's the question, where do we live? And it's an interesting question, I think, geographically, but it's an even more interesting question when you let it extend and expand into all the contexts in which we live. Where do we live? Where do we live could be answered as an address. It could be answered in the context of a physical space that we're in. Where am I right now could be one of the ways that you could answer that question. But it could also be a way of describing relationships. It could be a way of describing emotions. It could be a way of describing seasons. It could be a way of describing generations. It could be a way of describing epochs, right? I live in this part of the world. It could be huge in its definition, or it could be extremely particular. And the fact is that really all of those answers are legitimate. So at any one time, we are living in many spaces all in one moment. And that's part of what makes life so fascinating and interesting and challenging and rich. But it's also what can make it so daunting and overwhelming and disorienting. And if these places that we live fit nicely, then all may feel just very copacetic. But if in fact one of the places that we live, let's say our job doesn't match where we live when we're at home, or where we live in our economic life, or where we live in some other dimension, our physical health, for example, all those things start pulling at each other, well then our sense of well-being, our sense of place can be really put very much on edge. So I want to think about this because it's a major theme in the Bible. We all are very well aware that Scripture is filled with imagery of location and place, which is dominant especially in the Old Testament, but dominant in the New Testament as well. And I want tonight to look at one text that brings a number of these themes together in 1 Peter 1 and 2. Because the two great paradigms that I think we are all very well aware of in the Old Testament is really first the paradigm of the Exodus and then a paradigm of exile. And we're going to explore some of that, both of which are brought together in those opening chapters of 1 Peter and 2 Peter, 1 Peter 1 and 2. Let me tell you a little bit about where I have lived. I was raised in Washington State, and I was raised in a family of people who had a very deep, multi-generational commitment to land. One was in Eastern Oregon, one was in Eastern Washington. Both sides of my family had a very strong sense of place, and their identity was a lot about how they arrived in those places, how that land was cultivated, how they sort of lent their energy and passion and commitment to this space, how their life in those spaces affect them and their children. In my grandparents' case, both grandfathers died when the oldest child, 4 boys on one side, 4 girls on the other, when the oldest child was less than 10, leaving both moms as widows with 4 little children and businesses to run. In one case, it was a wheat ranch, and in the other case, it was the first electrical store in Eastern Washington. Now, so where did they live? Well, the ones that lived on the ranch lived on a ranch with no indoor plumbing and no electricity. And the 4 girls got to school by riding on the back of one horse that took them to the one-room schoolhouse where they were as little kids. Now, that was a location. You don't grow up in that setting, in that location, without a sense that it has put its mark on you, right? And even though obviously my mom's life goes on to include electricity and indoor plumbing and many other things, which she was quite happy to embrace, that starting location set a trajectory, which was a big story. Her mom took this great sadness of her husband's death as one of the great sorrows of her life, and believed that, in fact, life and the goodness of God could make a great life out of really sorrowful, painful experiences. My paternal grandmother experienced the same thing. 4 boys in this case. The oldest was less than 10, also left as a widow, also left as a business person, as a person who needed to run the first electrical store, as I mentioned. And in her case, her way of understanding this was pure tragedy, and she was the arch victim. So the primary mark on that family's life was really the sorrow of poor mom. That was actually what I thought her name was as a little boy. I thought her name was poor mom, because that was always how my dad referred to her. Poor mom. I thought it was kind of all one word, right? In that way that you kind of internalize as a little kid. So there's grandma, and then there's poor mom. And poor mom was a person who carried it in every way, all the way through her life. This sense that The tragedy had marked her so deeply, and for whatever the psychological and emotional reasons were, she simply could never get beyond it. So wherever else she went, whatever else she did, she was living in the sorrow of this sadness that had occurred early in her life. That trajectory sets in motion 4 children's lives on each side, 4 children's and families' lives that are so affected by that, right? That's location. Now, it's an emotional location in relationship to sad and challenging circumstances, all in the middle of the Depression, right? So you add yet another layer to this Cheech and Chong sort of skit almost of sadness and anguish that they're having to piece together in these days. Now, I grew up in a very different context. I grew up in a context with my father, who was alive until he was in his early 70s. I was in my early 30s when he died. My parents had grown up in a context of great love, really, in both sides of their family. My dad was a modernist, a scientist, an inventor, a person who had a very strong kind of scientific orientation of the world, and his sensibility was really that you should do everything possible to avoid religion because it was the great spoiler. And it was the spoiler for one primary reason, that it took great things and made them small. So you take the natural world as a scientist, and he would say, it is a world of stunning beauty, glory, range, majesty, discovery, all kinds of things yet to be discovered. And yet his experience of Christian influence, especially in relationship to this, was to put it under dogma, to have creation debates with your foot on each other's throats over what it is that you're going to say and do about a 6-day creation. Now, that was for my dad an example, of which he had many, of this feeling that you took something great and religion made it small. It made it seem pathetic and insignificant and less than it could otherwise have been. You take something like the beauty of the human body, the gifts of the human body, the celebration of human personality, and you put it under dogma, and people become rigid and uptight and anxious and fearful and worried. And it was yet another example of this smallness. So it was by no means natural to me to think, as a kid growing up, that I would have anything to do with the Christian religion. In fact, my father sort of made it a personal campaign to do everything he could to encourage my brother and me not to go down that road. It was a great shock when I started reading the New Testament and discovered that, in fact, Jesus and my dad had so much in common. That, in fact, Jesus also has a great concern for the way that religion makes things small, and that a great deal of the critique that we find in the Gospels of Jesus toward the scribes and Pharisees is really about the way that they take something great and glorious and actually make it small and insignificant. And that's part of what he's constantly sort of blowing up over the course of his ministry, because he is aware of the kind of crushing weight of all that. I used to bug my dad by saying, really, you should start reading the New Testament, Dad. You'd really be surprised at how much you and Jesus have in common. That did eventually happen, but not for many, 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 many years later. So it was a shock to me when I, through just reading and reading and rereading the Gospels, that I came to a discovery that I had been made by God, that I was made for imaginative, rich life of communion with God, communion with the world that God had made, communion with other people, and communion especially in the body of Christ. That was just a shocking discovery to me. And it felt like the whole universe was sort of cracking open. Now, eventually I told my parents this, and it was definitely an uncomfortable time, but my location was now changing. I still lived in their house. I was on my way to college, but I was now living in Christ in a whole new way. And that space created a completely different dynamic for me about what it meant to be a person, what it was that I thought about, what the issues were that were now becoming more and more primary in my life. My mom's faith was sort of latent and awakened through this process. She decides to go to church. She goes to a church. She tells the pastor that her son has had a religious experience. The pastor says to her that he would like to come and call on me as the son with the religious experience. And so on an otherwise beautiful spring day, I was going to get my first pastoral visit. So he came in and we started having a conversation. It was awkward and strained and a little weird. And eventually he says, I've come really for 3 reasons. The first is that your mom has told me that you've had a religious experience. The second is that might mean that you're going to become a pastor. That had definitely not occurred to me. And thirdly, I just finished doing what's called a Doctor of Ministry degree, and my project was a study of the pension plans of all the major denominations, and I wanted to be sure you knew which one had the best pension plan. Now, if there was ever a moment that confirmed everything my father had ever said about religion making things small, it was all distilled for me in that one moment. And silly me, I had thought I had begun to know the God of the universe, but it turned out I was just living in a world where I just needed a better pension plan. Now, I want to believe that that man had lived in more spacious places at some stage in his life, that his spiritual, theological vision had once been wide-ranging and open to the glories of God. But somewhere along the professional ecclesial line, it had all become a very small space about pension plans. Now, I share these stories simply to say, at the very beginning of my Christian life, it was clear to me that I was now living in a new place. I still had the same address, I was still living with the same family, I still love my family, but I was now living in a new space, and that space was going to have an explosive impact on my understanding of how I was going to look at the world around me, how I read the newspaper, how I engaged with neighbors, how I thought about the meaning of my life, how I engaged in the intellectual opportunities of college, et cetera, et cetera. All that was part of this expansiveness. But I was still, as we all always are, local. I'm still always in a given place at a given time. So where do I live? I live at the particular place that I actually live in. Now, fast forward, I eventually live in a variety of places outside Washington State, outside the country. I have the privilege of traveling and living and working outside the country at various times. And eventually, I get this call to come to Berkeley, to be, in the first case, the college pastor at the First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley, where I was for 6 years, away for 5.5, and back again. The very first day that I arrived in Berkeley, the moving truck that I had driven from Washington State down was parked outside the rental apartment that I was going to share with a graduate student who was doing a master's degree at Cal in English, and he had been on the search committee that called me. We decided we'd share this apartment. So I've driven down with my stuff, and I'm just about to unload it, and I get this call at that apartment from this young co-ed who was just going to start at Cal that fall, who wanted to meet me on the phone because she said, I'm so nervous to meet you, I just thought if I could introduce myself to you on the phone that it would be a little less anxious for me. So she tells me her life story in about 30 minutes. It was really a breathtaking story. It had amazing chapters and lots of drama, and all of it was finished, and then we hung up, and then she immediately called back because, as she said, I want to know whether you feel complete about our phone conversation. My first thought was, I must be in Berkeley. And my second thought was, I'm sure I do. I'm sure that's what I feel. I'm sure that would be it. I feel complete about our phone conversation. So, now the interesting thing about this apartment was that, that when the graduate student that I was going to share it with was looking for it, of course, I wasn't in the country to be interviewed, and that was sort of a hassle. So the church sent a letter along with him that said, honest, we promise he'll pay his bills on time, he will not destroy the property, etc. We vouch for him. But the person who eventually rented to us did have a lot of searing questions she wanted to ask him when he was trying to rent the apartment, and it all came down to one final question. She said it this way, but what if I meet him and he's rude and vile? Whoa, vile. Like, at the time that I first heard that, I thought, I'm not even sure that I know anyone who's vile. But I hadn't lived in Berkeley yet. And now to think about landlords who might wonder whether a person that's going to live in their property might be rude and vile, yeah, that's sort of a relevant question in actual fact. Back to the woman who's called on the phone. Later that week, we're having the first freshman gathering in this apartment where I now live with my graduate student roommate. And 25 freshmen roll up to this wonderful little gathering, and she goes into the bathroom and attempts suicide. So, very high drama. She does it through pills. She does it through all kinds of things that were happening in the bathroom, which I'll spare you the details of. And we call the police. Sorry, you're going to have to take care of it yourself. You need to get her out of there and get her to the hospital, which was a number of blocks away, in order to get her the help that she needs. You won't come. No, we won't come. So the next act was to break down the door of the bathroom, to have several guys that were there with me help carry her out of the apartment, out onto the street, where we're going to then put her in a car and take her to the hospital nearby. And just as we're coming out of the building, she sort of starts coming awake, and she starts kind of fighting and screaming, and she suddenly starts calling rape. And just at that moment, I get this tap on my shoulder. Excuse me, I haven't met you yet, but I'm the manager of the apartment building. What if I meet him and he's rude, vile, and a rapist? Now, all this is happening in the first week of being the college pastor at Berkeley. So I take her to the hospital. It's a whole amazing story. There's someone that I had gotten to hang out with the students. In the next couple of weeks, I go and see every single one of those 25 students. Not one of them ever came back to First Pres. So it was this amazing sense that, oh my gosh, this is a crazy place where in nanoseconds I'm facing crazy people who drive the first group of 25 students that I'm even meeting away because of this. And now this is where I'm called to be a pastor. What will it mean to be a pastor in this place? These were not experiences that I had had growing up in Yakima, Washington. These were not experiences that I had imagined having when I was attending Fuller Theological Seminary. These weren't experiences that I'd had in lots of other places, but these were now the experiences I was having in Berkeley, and it really, really did matter. On the very first Sunday, after that Sunday, I met Janet, who became my wife 15 months later. I'd known who she was because she'd lived in Seattle when I was living in Seattle. I had counseled two of her former boyfriends, so I knew who she was, but I didn't actually know her. And so we ended up meeting up. She ended up getting involved in the stuff that I was doing in college ministry. That became the pretext in which we got to know one another, and 15 months later we were married. Now, the interesting thing is that I stepped into Berkeley in another way through her, because it turns out that when we got married, we were the fourth generation in her family to meet and marry at the First Presbyterian Church of Berkeley. So her great-grandparents, her grandparents, her parents, and we all both met and married at this church. So that was a very, very significant thing. I'd never had that sort of legacy, certainly not related to a church. But lots of other things were changing, because now I was living in a more intensely multicultural, multi-ethnic context. I was living in a neighborhood surrounded by hundreds and hundreds of homeless people. I was in a context where I walked every day back and forth across People's Park with all the legacy of People's Park as a place of riots and demonstrations in the 60s. I was next to this campus, which was an eclectic, fascinating, demanding, amazing place, and where the academic demands of Cal were great, and where the privilege of being among those students was really exciting to me, but also presented yet another set of challenges. Ministry, life, relationships, romance doesn't happen in midair. It always happens in a very specific, grounded place with a really particular personality and all the kind of demographics that go along with that. And all through that, the Bible will say, you live, ultimately in the New Testament, in Christ. And you live, in the language of these two great paradigms I want us to think about, you live both in Exodus and you live in exile. And all that's also happening as we live in Berkeley or in Los Ranchos Presbytery. I was thinking about this and chose this theme largely because of thinking about just the sound of that place. I've never lived in Los Ranchos Presbytery. That's a new thing about moving from Washington, which has mostly Indian names, to moving to California, which has mostly Spanish names. So there's a sense of, this is a different location. This has boundaries, this has personality, this has an economy, this has housing, this has geographic location and proximity to various things, and distance from other things. It has a sense of location that for some people is the very best and most wonderful thing, and for other people it's a problematical thing for all kinds of reasons that could be intrinsic to their life or their family or associations that they have. All that's true, and all that's happening while we live in Exodus and exile. Now, I want us to think just briefly about that and then look into this text in 1 Peter 1 and 2. So, we live as the individual people we are, in a body, in an actual physical, geographical address. We live in a context of relationships. We live in some country. We live usually with citizenship, not always. We live in a context where there's expectations. We live inside a job if we're fortunate enough to be employed. We live in a context of a church where there's opportunities for many varied and wonderful things, and also salty, weird, and strange and challenging things. All that's true. And we live in Exodus and exile. Now, in the Exodus paradigm, it's really easy. Where does Israel live when they're just before the Exodus? They live in Egypt. They are living in a context which is fairly straightforwardly defined as simply a context of oppression, of slavery. of bondage. And in that context, it's really clear who the good guys are and who the bad guys are. Israel's the good guys, Egypt's the bad guys. It's clear what the trajectory is. Get out of Egypt. Like, get as far away from Egypt as possible, and if possible, get to what God had promised, which was the promised land. And through a process of deliverance and rescue and redemption and escape, God provides this new location, but not before, in between here and there, there's this 40 years in the wilderness, where now we live neither in Egypt nor in the promised land, but in this in-between space. It's worth just pausing for a moment on that. Obviously, this keeps becoming a repetitive biblical metaphor, right? We live in between where we've been and where we're going, and sometimes the in-between space, between the already and not yet, is always the space that we're going to be in one big sense. But yet there is this practical trajectory in Israel's life. They don't always live in the wilderness. They do actually eventually make it to the promised land. And in the promised land comes both exactly what they expected and not at all what they expected. So the promised land holds a place, but it also holds danger and warfare and suffering and challenges that the promised land brings with it. But not in the way that the promised land in its language and stereotype gets used in our American context. So the American church is largely born, I would argue, because America is largely born out of a kind of Exodus paradigm. Many, many, many people come here because they are fleeing someplace in order to find the promised land. Some people arrived in New Jersey and thought that was it. And then other people thought, maybe not. And they kept kind of moving. And some people thought it was Minnesota. They stay, and that's really, for them, the promised land. And other people thought, no, it's really, I don't know, Los Ranchos Presbytery area, where finally you get to the promised land. And a lot about the culture of America, which is so profound, and tags in so conveniently with what ultimately develops as the kind of pragmatic, consumerist American Christianity that has unfolded, is all about finding, getting, claiming, building, having our promised land. So the faith that we preach is often promised land preaching. It's about grace, it's about finding rest and peace in God, it's about finding community, it's about finding the hope in the afterlife, it's about finding something that is like the great promise that you think you want. And Jesus becomes really, potentially, the delivery service for this byproduct. So if you're looking for ... fill in the blank, Jesus can be the one who can provide you with that. And a lot of the way the church is built is by the portraits that we give of what that promised land looks like. Come to our church and usually what we want to offer is some sort of promised land experience. You will find ... And there are real things to be found. This is not, by any means, entirely a form of direct or indirect mockery. There is really wonderful things. There are really wonderful things that can be found in our context and in our churches. But when our spirituality is overly tied to that kind of paradigm, and where the promised land is really a function of what we can get our hands on, then it's especially problematical because it plays so much into the downside of how this can just become a kind of consumeristic sort of vision. But Jesus picks up on the Exodus language strongly and talks about the fact that we move from death to life, about the fact that we are in bondage moving to slavery, that we are people that are in need of being brought to life. All of that language, which Paul obviously, again, continues and extends in such a significant way in his own portrait of the significance of what the kingdom of God is really about. So the Exodus language is big, and all of us have hopefully come into the life of our experience of Christ and God's love in such a way that it is an Exodus journey. I mean, I could easily spend hours talking about the places from which I have been delivered over time by the goodness and grace of God that has spared me and saved me from foolishness, from folly, from sin, from lostness, from fear and anxiety and all kinds of things that have easily diverted my attention. And the story of my faith couldn't even imaginably be told without telling it in part as an Exodus story. But the other side of the story is that in the other major paradigm in the Old Testament is, of course, the story of exile, which is, frankly, a much more complicated story. And in the story of the exile, Israel is a perpetrator. They're being sent into exile not because of some oppressor. Babylon didn't just come along, not in the way that it's portrayed in the Old Testament. Babylon came along because God wanted to send Israel into exile under Babylonian rule in order to teach Israel some things that they seem to be unable, unwilling, unprepared to learn outside that exile. And in that exile, they are implicated. And now the goal is not to get out. There's not the goal of getting out of Babylon. Of course, Israel longed for that. But now God says, I'm not interested in rescuing you from Babylon. I want you to be in Babylon. I've sent you to Babylon. Stripped of all of the architecture, the liturgy, all the symbols and signs that tell you where do you live, well, now you don't live there anymore. Now you live as strangers in a strange land. Now you are aliens. You are exiles. All the cues that you're looking for that tell you that you're home, you're not home. That's the point. You're not home. Now, as you're not home, let me ask you, where do you live? And one of the great responses that's given in a lot of the exilic literature, and I think, of course, especially of Daniel, is an example of saying, I'm going to practice living as a person who lives in relationship to Yahweh, even as I dwell in Nebuchadnezzar's house. That kind of reality. I know where I live, even as an exile and a stranger. I was so moved when Ben Weir, a number of years ago, when he was taken captive and held hostage in the Middle East during the whole Iranian captivity, later reported about his experience. And he said, the very first day after his captivity, he said, I woke up and he said, the very first thing that I did was that I not only thought about my captivity, but he said, I realized everything is the same today as it was yesterday before I was taken captive. It's just that now I'm a captive. I'm still a disciple of Jesus Christ. I'm still married to the same person. I still am the father of 2 girls. I'm still a Presbyterian missionary. I'm still devoted to the same friends and neighbors. I'm still committed to this country in which I'm now found as somebody who's been taken hostage, blindfolded, and chained to a radiator. I'm still the same in every significant way, except I'm now in exile. I'm now in bondage. I'm now as a hostage. An amazing grounding. And he said, every day I kept having to tell myself, where am I? Where do I live? Where am I in time? Where am I in space? So he said, I figured out right away that I would lose my mind if I ever lost track of time. So I needed to figure out, what day of the week is it? What date is it? And he said, I had a whole system, which I think was worked out of certain marks on the wall or something on the ceiling, I've forgotten which it was, but a pattern which he decided would be the pattern that he would use as the cue to tell him every day exactly what day of the week it was. He never wanted to lose track of time. He wanted to know where he was in the calendar. He wanted to know whether it was Christmas, whether it was Easter, whether it was his wife's birthday, whether it was their anniversary. As he went through this process of remembering as an exile, as a person, as a hostage, an amazing sense of living as a grounded person, right? I'm in exile, but I'm the same person. Now, the call in 1 Peter, if you have Bibles, let me just invite you to turn there for a second. We're going to look briefly at the first couple of chapters. What we hear is Peter, a person who understands both Exodus and exile themes. And what we hear, I think, here is this deep sense of a call to live in our home in exile. And both themes are picked up in chapters 1 and 2. So the first chapter of finding our home is really this affirmation of the great Exodus theme, which is part of the cross and resurrection of Jesus. We begin reading. Actually, we'll start at 1:1. Paul, an apostle of Jesus Christ, to the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia, who have been chosen and destined by God the Father and sanctified by the Spirit to be obedient to Christ and to be sprinkled with his blood. May grace and peace be yours in abundance. Amazing opening. This is so not a Pauline opening. It has elements of rhetorical form that are similar, but it's the content, the vocabulary is a Peter-like vocabulary, right? And it's especially picking up and introducing this theme of exile, which is going to develop more at the beginning of chapter 2. Then this is our home. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. By his great mercy he has given us a new birth into a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, and into an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you, who are being protected by the power of God through faith for a salvation ready to be revealed in the last time. In this you rejoice, even if now for a little while you have had to suffer various trials, so the genuineness of your faith, being more precious than gold, though perishable, is tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor when Jesus Christ is revealed. Although you have not seen him, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice with an indescribable and glorious joy, for you are receiving the outcome of your faith, the salvation of your souls. The language that he's using is a language of in-between times. There's a sense of anticipation that's not yet fulfilled. But it begins with this resounding sense that we have now been born into a living hope. We have a new context. So we live every day in a world like the world that we live in, a world of sorrow and suffering, just as Peter did, a world where the Roman authority was still oppressive, where the Roman tyranny was real, where the dominance of Rome over the landscape, architecturally, economically, politically, socially, was extraordinary. And they've been born into a living hope in the midst of that world. Now, we're still waiting for its fulfillment, he says. There still is more yet to come. But let's not rush on before we first acknowledge what has actually been given, that you have been born into a living hope. Now, our life as pastors, and certainly as Christians in our culture and world, is, I think, being put to the test in a very dramatic way in these days. It feels to me like it would be hard to find another moment when there is as much movement on every front, in almost every direction as we experience today. It feels as though not only change, but dramatic change and dramatic crises are occurring all around the globe in every system, institution, nation. So it's all a major landscape of transition. And a lot of it is extremely rough and painful and violent. There are 4 billion people in the world that live outside the rule of law, who, if a bully comes along and does whatever they choose to do to us, we have no place to turn. We are simply without defense, unless there's just simply some buddies of ours that are going to band together and get the bully. But since that seldom happens, because usually bullies get their bullies to help them be better bullies, the reality of that kind of violence is just rampant. We think about the tragedy that's going on, it seems these days, almost every day, with yet another incident of significant random killings of people in violent circumstances. We think of the way that institutions, economic institutions, stable economic institutions, are now, of course, in extremely precarious circumstances. We see escalating random examples of unbelievable financial gain and excess at the cost of extraordinary human suffering, even of middle class, let alone of the truly poor. Now, all that is happening while institutions like family, like schools, like ordinary businesses, like governments, are also in extraordinary turmoil. Now, some of that might be highly productive and even eventually fruitful, but on any given day, it can be pretty hard to experience what Peter's describing here as this undefiled, imperishable hope. So the first thing I want us to think about tonight is not how are we going to cope with Exodus and how are we going to make peace with exile, but how do we appropriate more deeply and profoundly living out of hope. Our denomination is an example of this. There's all kinds of things that a person could point to about why and what it is that's going on in our denomination. But I would say that in a certain way, it doesn't even really matter what the particulars are. I think the nature of almost every institution is undergoing radical redefinition. We have our own particular occasions for why it is that our denomination is having the rancor and challenges that it's having, and those matter. But in the midst of that, and in the midst of so much else that's going on, how do we actually live in hope? This is partly what exposes, I think, our tendency toward the false promised land that I was describing before. We've wanted to say, oh, well, as long as we basically have a grip on things, as long as the economy keeps our churches afloat, as long as we more or less have cultural propriety to be able to do what we want to do, as long as there isn't too much war among the people of God, as long as we're more or less sort of getting along okay, we can kind of feel good. But right now, it's just a lot harder to find all those easy hooks that say, no, really, everything is pretty good. In fact, there's a lot of reasons to find hooks that go, it's not just really good. There's actually really some significant problems, deep, profound, theological and non-theological problems that are shaping the culture and experience of many, many people. and especially people, frankly, that are at the margins. But this question of how we live, as Peter says, in this living hope, feels to me like it's meant to be our most distinctive quality. That the people in Christ are not free from suffering, they're not free from institutional chaos, they're not free from difficulty and struggle and pain and anguish, but we are meant to be marked by this undefilable, imperishable, living hope. Is that really where we are? What would help us to recover life out of deep, abiding hope? Again, sometimes temperaments can mask this, because many people that go into ministry are people that have relatively buoyant, optimistic spirits, it turns out. A lot of studies that are done say, well, pastors are sort of hopeful people. So a lot of our hope can just be a function of personality, temperament. Some people that go into ministry really are not that. Some of why some people go into ministry is partly because they have an acute sensitivity toward places of struggle and pain. And our ministry leads us to identify and empathize with all of those things. And how do we actually, in those times and places, then live out of this deep, living hope? Especially when the circumstances that we may be facing, the challenges that might be before us are very real. So Peter is acutely aware of that. If there was anybody in the early apostolic band that had any reason to be completely caught in despair, it would have been Peter. His final words with Jesus, it seems to me, in the Gospel of John, are amazing words on Jesus' side, but they do not seem to me to tie it all up with a bow and leave Peter with going, let's move on to joy. That's not where I hear John ending. It's much more like, oh my gosh, really? Really, 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 really feed my sheep, feed my sheep, feed my sheep. Really. By the time we get to this moment, I'm assuming Peter's authorship, there is this amazing sense that Peter has moved to a profound place beyond his despair, beyond his guilt, beyond his anxiety, his sense of tragedy about what had occurred and what he himself had participated in, and was now living in this real hope, this living hope. And he writes this letter, I think, with an exceptional passion, because he's aware that there's actually been a reality that's been discovered. And it's like a new address. It's what Paul in shorthand means by in Christ. That's not Peter's language, but that's Paul's language for saying it's in the resurrected Christ. We live in the life of God. And in that context, in that place, we find the promised land, which is now not a promised land of circumstances, but a promised land of spiritual reality that now allows us to live in Christ as we live in Los Ranchos Presbytery, as we live in the state of California, as we live on the West Coast with its earthquakes, storms, and fires, with the reality of violence, with human trafficking, with the suffering of people that are poor and not and have no citizenship. So incredibly complicated times, and in that, a living hope. Is that really where we dwell? Do we have a sense of knowing how to live into and out of that? Peter, I think, writes this to make that appeal and to say there's going to be all kinds of things, certainly in the early church. There were lots of reasons for despair. There were lots of reasons for distraction, anxiety, for finding all kinds of reasons to think this Jesus thing was fine for a day, for a week, or for a little bit longer, but not for the long haul, not for the long journey of faith, not least in relationship to Rome, not least when the heat is going to be turned way up. Now, if we read through the rest of this chapter, it seems to me that you continue to hear language like that about living in this. And the most critical phrase that I think I want to just highlight for just a moment is in verse 13. Therefore, prepare your minds for action. I love that combination. Verse 13, 113, prepare your minds for action. In Peter's framework, I think, one of the dimensions of living hope is actually getting the truth of that in us. Let it actually become a training point in your mind. This is, I think, again, Paul's language in Romans 12, 1 and 2, and he says, I beg you, my brothers and sisters, as an act of intelligent worship, to present your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and acceptable to God, which is your spiritual worship. Do not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. I think Peter's language for that is, in verse 13, therefore, prepare your minds. But it's not just for thought. It's integrally linked to prepare your mind for action. You will actually do the truth if you are perceiving and engaging with the truth. If you're living out into this living hope, it will begin to show up in the way that you actually act in the world as a person of living hope. It's not just a kind of interior conviction or a mental framework, an abstraction. It's a conviction of the truth that changes our perception and sends us into action in the world as people of hope. And he gives examples of that in holiness. Discipline yourselves. Set all your hope on the grace that Jesus Christ will bring you when he is revealed. What a statement. Set all your hope that the budget will be met, that the person will show up, that the donor will be given, that the decision will be made, that the program will happen, that the building will be built, right? No, that's not how Peter writes it. Set all your hope on the grace that Jesus Christ will bring you when he is revealed. Like obedient children, do not be conformed to the desires that you formerly had in ignorance. Instead, as he who called you is holy, be holy yourselves in all your conduct. For it is written, you shall be holy, for I am holy. That amazing sense of a coherence, a consistency, a purity of heart, mind, soul, and strength. All that, I think, is an aspect for Peter of what this life of holy living is about, and of living in the living hope of Christ. Now, if you flip over to chapter 2, at the beginning of chapter 2, he turns, I think, from this Exodus imagery much more to exile. Listen to what he says here. Come to him, a living stone, though rejected by mortals, yet chosen and precious in God's sight. And like living stones, let yourselves be built into a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For it stands in Scripture, see, I am laying in Zion a stone, a cornerstone, chosen and precious, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. To you then, who believe, he is precious. But for those who do not believe, the stone that the builders rejected has become the very head of the corner, and a stone that makes them stumble, a rock that makes them fall. Many scholars suggest that some of this language is really very much about the rebuilding of the temple, and that we are now becoming post-exilic people who are now meant to be the habitation of this God. And now, as people who have been through exile, now are being built as strangers in a strange land, which is the image that he goes on to build, to work with a little bit more in just a moment. And in that context, we become the living evidence, the apologetic for the reality of God's grace and love in the world. They stumble because they disobey the word as they were destined to do. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's own people, in order that you may proclaim the mighty acts of him who called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. That's partly the Exodus call. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Once you had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. Beloved, I urge you as aliens and exiles to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war against the soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they malign you as evildoers, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. This incredible exilic life. Demonstrate that you have trained your minds for action, and let it show up as you live as aliens and strangers. And let the reality of a truth that's greater than your own circumstances be the story that's actually told about you. You live in Nebuchadnezzar's house, but you belong to Yahweh. You live in the context of Roman authority, but you belong to Jesus Christ. And the evidence of that is this unexpected set of actions, that we actually live differently, we love differently, we give ourselves differently, we live more honorably. We pursue, in Jeremiah 29 language, we pursue the shalom of our enemies in the city, for in their shalom we will find our shalom. I think very much the same kind of imagery that Peter's using here to describe, show up as peculiar people. Be people who are filled with unexpected, dramatic, generous compassion and love and mercy. And then the only explanation for that kind of life will be that you're living from beyond yourselves by living in a God of living hope, right? So there's this sense that this is what ties the two things together. The living hope is the faithfulness and love of God. That is our Exodus hope. But the living hope is also the hope that we have with us as we live in exile. So we live in a context of a culture, subcultures, personal circumstances, social circumstances, global circumstances, where in fact we are strangers. And we acknowledge that what primarily defines our life, as he says here, is really the reality of God's love. There's been the new place in which we now find our life. And as we live in that place, we begin to live differently than we would otherwise. And then that shows up, not least to those who are the people among whom we dwell as strangers and aliens. So this is a lot to hold on to. And I want to just pause and have a little conversation with you and then have you have some conversation with each other. What I've tried to sketch is that, partly out of my own story, we all live in multiple contexts simultaneously. But theologically speaking, we also have two additional layers. We live as people caught up in this great Exodus story that will one day find its ultimate fulfillment. But we also live in a context of exile, where I would say the more relevant image to describe the church today is actually how are we going to live as exiles, especially when the church wants to live as people who are on Exodus. We just want to get to the promised land. That's the way our theology has functioned. Offer people the promised land and then show up and give it to them. And the good news is instead, the promised land's coming, but today and tomorrow, and probably as long as you live, exile is going to be a whole lot more the territory that we dwell in than the promised land. So we get a stake of the promised land, the earnest money that Paul talks about, the sense of the living hope that is the down payment, the lived experience of God. But now we live it not out of perfect resolution, not in the happy zone, but really in this very challenging season and place where we're somehow going to have to hold on to that living hope and be awkward and alien and strangers. Because that's actually, according to Peter, part of how that part of the church would show up demonstrating the faithfulness and love of God. And I think it's part of what our culture is wondering. Will the church show up as peculiar people? Peculiar in a quality of love and mercy and justice that actually demonstrates that our life is not simply the life of everyone else. So when Ron Sider and other people do studies that demonstrate that so much about the American church just looks exactly like the culture that's around us, it suggests that we haven't done too well living as exiles. We've decided to just move in and make it home. And suggests, well, really, it's probably better for Nebuchadnezzar if we just, go along with his dietary law, because then it won't be awkward for him and we'll have a better witness when the moment comes. But then the moment doesn't really ever come, and when it does come, we're not really ready for it. It's like the call that was given a few years ago when the PUP report came out in our denomination that called us as a denomination to discernment. What could have been better? By all means, we should be called to discernment. But there's almost nothing in the fabric of the Presbyterian Church that has actually established a community that would be prepared to exercise discernment. What we do is vote. We've exercised decision-making, not discernment. Those are not the same things, and they lead to radically different results. So it made total sense to say, by all means, we should call the denomination to discernment, but then we would have to reinvent ourselves in order to become a discernment-oriented denomination. That's just not what we've done. We've educated people to become voters, not discerners. And the reality of those two things can intersect, but they're by no means synonymous with each other. So it's an example of feeling like there's just a lot of paradigm shifting that has to go on to say, how do we experience that we live in exile? How do we embrace exilic living? How do we come to make peace with that? Because we are not alone. We are, as Peter has so strongly said, born into a living hope. We live in a living hope, but we also live in exile in a living hope. And it's those two things being held together, which is in part to me a description of where the church probably has often been, typically been, and it's certainly part of the world that I think the world that you minister in and I minister in. So the tension is this tension between this deep sense of living hope, which doesn't actually put exile to end. It actually calls us to engage exile. So this is why Jesus, I think, as we're going to see tomorrow, uses language like light and salt to describe the church. That's not needed if you're in the promised land, and the promised land is a happy zone. But if in fact the world is dark, it needs light. If the world is rotting, it needs salt. There's going to be an angularity, a saltiness, an anxiety, a pressure point, an unrest that's built into authentic discipleship, which again, I think often we've been reticent to actually acknowledge and then surprised that people find it inauthentic or that it seems to be lacking in any relevance to the real issues and challenges that we're facing at a time, especially like this one. In the dissonance, there's both dissonance and hope in the dissonance. And it's that affirmation that I think Peter is in touch with. Born to a living hope, born to a living hope, born to a living hope. There have been times for me in ministry and in life where I've really had extreme darkness, extreme acute darkness. And it sometimes has lasted for long seasons. It sometimes has been more punctiliar. Sometimes it's been inward challenges. Other times it's been things that, just problems, issues that I feel like I've needed to grapple with. And in the context of that, I have found those 5 words as just many others, so like a kind of Jesus prayer to me, of just standing in the face of that, letting the raw reality of the need just kind of wash over me, and to just claim this is a place too where Jesus Christ is meant to be Lord. What does it mean to seek and find a living hope? What would it mean to live as a person born to a living hope in a context where it feels almost impossible even to live at times, let alone live in relationship to a living hope? That's, to me, a place of birth, of encouragement, of nurture that feels like it's often maybe just the beginning of a toehold, but it's over time become a place that has been for me a place of great reflection and renewal of spirit when I've just realized, this is the core of it. I don't need a game plan. I don't need a fix. I need first and foremost just to acknowledge that this is a place where Jesus Christ wants to make a real and tangible difference. If that was the case, what would it mean for me to live as a person born to a living hope? What would it mean to nurture other people into being themselves born to a living hope? What would it mean to bring living hope to that particular need? Because I don't know about you, but I can tell you that it's been my experience as a pastor that almost regardless of the time, the frame, the setting, the circumstances, on a random Sunday when I'm preaching to a congregation that I know extremely well to a congregation that I don't know at all, when I start preaching about hope, there is something palpable that happens in the sanctuary. And to me, it's an evidence of just how desperate the world is for that, how hungry we are for real hope, not for any kind of slick hope, not for something superficial, not for something that doesn't take complexity and the reality of the need at face value. Anything that suggests that it's a kind of easy Band-Aid is not a living hope, but somebody who's prepared to name the raw need and a hope in the face of that need. That's what Peter's doing, and that's where I think people lean and where they should be leaning toward the church for the evidences of that. But are we bearing fruit of a life that looks like we have been born to a living hope? That's surely the cornerstone of our witness. So it's the cornerstone of the great gift that God gives us in our identity, and it's the cornerstone that explains what our witness in the world is meant to be. And it will take all kinds of manifestations as we receive it and as we give it. There's nothing sort of cookie cutter about it. It takes all kinds of shapes. But it's that turning point. Have we experienced a living hope? Can we experience a living hope? Where do we need a living hope? And let me just encourage you to make time to pray for that.